Rome and Carthage. The Semitic colony of Carthage on the northern coast of Africa and the Indo-European city of Rome and the west coast of Italy fought each other for possession of the western Mediterranean, and Carthage was destroyed. The little Phoenician trading post of Carthage stood on a low hill which overlooked the African Sea. A stretch of water, 90 miles wide, which separates Africa from Europe, was an ideal spot for a commercial center. Almost too ideal. It grew too fast and became too rich. When in the 6th century before our era, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed Tyre, Carthage broke off all further relations with the mother country and became an independent state, the great western advance post of the Semitic races. Unfortunately, the city had inherited many of the traits which for 1,000 years had been characteristics of the Phoenicians. It was a vast business house, protected by a strong navy, indifferent to most of the finer aspects of life. The city and the surrounding country and the distant colonies were all ruled by a small but exceedingly powerful group of rich men. The Greek word for rich is plutos, and the Greeks called such a government by rich men a plutocracy. Carthage was a plutocracy, and the real power of the state lay in the hands of the dozen big ship owners and mine owners and merchants who met in the back room of an office and regarded their common fatherland as a business enterprise which ought to yield them a decent profit. They were, however, wide awake and full of energy and worked very hard. As the years went by, the influence of Carthage upon her neighbors increased until the greater part of the African coast, Spain, and certain regions of France were Carthaginian possessions, and paid tribute, taxes, and dividends to the mighty city of the African Sea. Of course, such a plutocracy was forever at the mercy of a word. As long as there was plenty of work and wages were high, the majority of the citizens were quite connected, allowed their betters to rule them, and asked no embarrassing questions. But when no ship left the harbor, when no ore was brought to the smelting ovens, when dock workers and stevedores were thrown out of employment, then there were grumblings, and there was a demand that the popular assembly be called together, as in the olden days when Carthage had been a self-governing republic. To prevent such an occurrence, the plutocracy was obliged to keep the business of the town going at full speed. They had managed to do this very successfully for almost 500 years, and they were greatly disturbed by certain rumors which reached them from the western coast of Italy. It was said that a little village on the banks of the Tiber had suddenly risen to a great power and was making itself the acknowledged leader of all the Latin tribes who inhabited central Italy. It was also said that this village, which by the way was called Rome, intended to build ships and go after the commerce of Sicily and the southern coast of France. Carthage could not possibly tolerate such competition. The young rival must be destroyed, lest the Carthaginian rulers lose their prestige and the absolute rulers of the western Mediterranean. The rumors were duly investigated, and in a general way, these were the facts that came to light. The west coast of Italy had long been neglected by civilization, whereas in Greece, all the good harbors faced eastward enjoyed a full view of the busy islands of the Aegean. The west coast of Italy contemplated nothing more exciting than the desolate waves of the Mediterranean. The country was poor, it was therefore rarely visited by the foreign merchants, and the natives were allowed to live in undisturbed possession of their hills and their marshy plains. The first serious invasion of this land came from the north. At an unknown date, certain Indo-European tribes had managed to find their way through the passes of the Alps and had pushed southward until they had filled the heel and the toe of the famous Italian boot with their villages and their flocks. Of these early conquerors we know nothing. No Homer sang their glory. Their own accounts of the foundation of Rome, written 800 years later when the little city had become the center of an empire, are fairy stories and do not belong in a history. Romulus and Remus, jumping across each other's walls, always forget who jumped across whose wall, make entertaining reading, but the foundation of the city of Rome was a much more prosaic affair. Rome began as 1,000 American cities have done, by being a convenient place for barter and horse trading. It lay in the heart of the plains of central Italy. The Tiber provided direct access to the sea. The land road from north to south found here a convenient ford which could be used all the year around, and 7 little hills along the banks of a river offered the inhabitants a safe shelter against their enemies who lived in the mountains and those who lived beyond the horizon of a nearby sea. The mountaineers were called the Sabines. They were a rough crowd with an unholy desire for easy plunder, but they were very backward. They used stone axes and wooden shields, and were no match for the Roman with their steel swords. The sea people, on the other hand, were dangerous foes. They were called the Ursuans, and they were, and still are, one of the greatest mysteries of history. Nobody knew or knows whence they came, who they were, what they had driven them away from their original homes. We have found the remains of their cities and their cemeteries, and their waterworks all along the Italian coast. We are familiar with their inscriptions, as no one has ever been able to decipher the Etruscan alphabet. These written messages are, so far, merely annoying and not at all useful. Our best guess is that Etruscans came originally from the Asia Minor, and that a great war on a pestilence of that country had forced them to go away and seek a new home elsewhere. Whatever the reason for their coming, the Etruscans played a great role in history. They carried the pollen of the ancient civilization from the east to the west, and they taught the Romans, who, as we know, came from the north, the first principle of architecture and street building, and fighting and art and cookery, and medicine and astronomy. But just as the Greeks had not loved their Aegean teachers, in the same way did the Romans hate their Etruscan masters. They got rid of them as soon as they could, and the opportunity offered itself when Greek merchants discovered the commercial possibilities of Italy, and when the first Greek vessels reached Rome. The Greeks came to trade, but they stayed to instruct. They found the tribes who inhabited the Roman countryside, and who were called the Latins, quite willing to learn such things as might be of practical use. At once they understood the great benefit that could be derived from a written alphabet, and they copied that of the Greeks. They also understood the commercial advantages of a well-regulated system of coins and measures and weights. Eventually, the Romans swallowed Greek civilization hook, line, and sinker. They even welcomed the gods of the Greeks to their country. Zeus was taken to Rome, where he became known as Jupiter, and the other divinities followed him. The Roman gods, however, never were quite like their cheerful cousins, who had accompanied the Greeks on their road through life and through history. The Roman gods were state functionaries. Each one managed his own department with great prudence and a deep sense of justice. But in turn, he was exact in demanding the obedience of his worshippers. This obedience of the Romans rendered with scrupulous care, but they never established the cordial personal relations with the charming friendships which had existed between the old Hellenes and the mighty residents of a high Olympic peak. The Romans did not imitate the Greeks' form of government, but being of the same Indo-European stock as the people of Hellas, the early history of Rome resembles that of Athens and other Greek cities. They did not find it difficult to get rid of their kings, the descendants of the ancient tribal chieftains. But once the kings had been driven from the city, the Romans were forced to bridle the power of the nobles, and it took many centuries before they managed to establish a system which gave every free citizen of Rome a chance to take a personal interest in the affairs of his town. Thereafter, the Romans enjoyed one great advantage over the Greeks. They managed the affairs of their country without making too many speeches. They were less imaginative than the Greeks, and they preferred an ounce of action to a pound of words. They understood the tendency of a multitude, the plebe as the assemblage of free citizens was called, only too well to waste valuable time upon mere talk. They therefore placed the actual business of running the city into the hands of 2 councils, who were assisted by a council of elders called the Senate, because the word senex means an old man. As a matter of custom and practical advantage, the senators were elected from the nobility. but their power had not been strictly defined. Rome at one time had passed through the same sort of struggle between the poor and the rich which had forced Athens to adopt the laws of Draco and Solon. In Rome, this conflict had occurred in the 5th century BC as a result of free men had obtained a written code of laws which protected them against the despotism of the aristocratic judges by the institution of a tribune. These tribunes were city magistrates elected by the free men. They had the right to protect any citizen against those actions of the government officials which were thought to be unjust. A council had a right to condemn a man to death, but if the case had not been absolutely proved, the tribune could interfere and save the poor fellow's life. But when I use the word Rome, I seem to refer to a little city of a few thousand inhabitants, and the real strength of Rome lay in the country's districts outside her walls, and it was in the government of these outlying provinces that Rome, at an early age, showed her wonderful gift as a colonizing power. In very early times, Rome had been the only strongly fortified city in central Italy. It had always offered a hospitable refuge to other Latin tribes who happened to be in danger of attack. The Latin neighborhoods had recognized the advantages of a close union with such a powerful friend, and they had tried to find a basis of some sort of defensive and offensive alliance. Other nations, Egyptians, Babylonians, Phoenicians, even Greeks, would have insisted upon a treaty of submission on the part of the barbarians. The Romans did nothing of the sort. They gave the outsider a chance to become partners in a common respublica, or commonwealth. You want to join us, they said? Very well, go ahead and join. We shall treat you as if you were full-fledged citizens of Rome. In return for this privilege, we expect you to fight for our city, the mother of us all, whenever it shall be necessary. The outsider appreciated this generosity, and he showed his gratitude by this unserving loyalty. Whenever a Greek city had been attacked, the foreign residents had moved out as quickly as they could. Why defend something which meant nothing to them but a temporary boarding house in which they were tolerated, as long as they paid their bills? But when the enemy was before the gates of Rome, all the Latins rushed to her defense. It was their mother who was in danger. It was their true home, even if they lived 100 miles away and had never seen the walls of the sacred hills. No defeat and no disaster could change this sentiment. In the beginning of the 4th century BC, the wild Gauls forced their way into Italy. They had defeated the Roman army near the river Allia and had marched upon the city. They had taken Rome, and then they expected that the people could come home and sue for peace. They waited, but nothing happened. After a short time, the Gauls found themselves surrounded by a hostile population, which made it impossible for them to obtain supplies. After 7 months, hunger forced them to withdraw. The policy of Rome to treat the foreigner on equal terms had proved a great success, and Rome stood stronger than ever before. A short account of the early history of Rome shows you that the enormous differences between the Roman ideal of a healthy state and that of an ancient world which had embodied in the town of Carthage. The Romans counted upon the cheerful and the hearty cooperation between a number of equal citizens. The Carthaginians, following the example of Egypt and Western Asia, insisted upon the unreasoning and therefore unwilling obedience of the subjects, and when these failed, they hired professional soldiers to do their fighting for them. We will now understand why Carthage was bound to fear such a clever and powerful army, and why the plutocracy of Carthage was only too willing to pick a quarrel, that they might destroy the dangerous rival before it was too late. But the Carthaginians, being good businessmen, knew that it never pays to rush matters. They proposed to the Romans that the respective cities draw 2 circles on the map, and that each town claim one of these circles as her own sphere of influence, and promised to keep out of the other fellow's circle. The agreement was promptly made, and was broken just as promptly when both sides thought it wise to send their armies to Sicily, where a rich soil and a bad government invited foreign interference. The war which followed, the so-called First Punic War, lasted 24 years. It was fought out on the high seas, and in the beginning, it seemed that the experienced Carthaginian navy would defeat the newly created Roman fleet. Following their ancient tactics, the Carthaginian ships would either ram the enemy vessels, or by a bold attack from the side, they would break their oars and would then kill the sailors in the helpless vessel with their arrows and with fireballs. But Roman engineers invented a new craft which carried a boarding bridge, across which the Roman infantrymen stormed the hostile ship. Then there was a sudden end to the Carthaginian victories. At the Battle of Mylae, their fleet was badly defeated. Carthage was obliged to sue for peace, and Sicily became part of the Roman domains. 23 years later, new trouble arose. Rome in quest of copper had taken the island of Sardinia. Carthage in quest of silver thereupon occupied all of southern Spain. This made Carthage a direct neighbor of the Romans. The latter did not like this at all, and they ordered their troops to cross the Pyrenees and watch the Carthaginian army of occupation. The stage was set for the second outbreak between the two rivals. Once more, a Greek colony was the pretext for a war. The Carthaginians were besieging Saguntum on the east coast of Spain. The Saguntinian appealed to Rome, and Rome as usual was willing to help. The Senate promised the help of the Latin armies, but the preparation of this expedition took some time, and meanwhile, Saguntum had been taken and had been destroyed. This had been done in direct opposition of the will of Rome. The Senate decided upon war. One Roman army was to cross the African Sea and make a landing on Carthaginian soil. A second division was to keep the Carthaginian armies occupied in Spain and prevent them from rushing to the aid of the hometown. It was an excellent plan, and everybody expected a great victory, but the gods had decided otherwise. In the fall of the year of 218 before the birth of Christ, and the Roman army, which was to attack the Carthaginians in Spain, had left Italy. People were eagerly awaiting for news of an easy and complete victory, when a terrible rumor began to spread through the plain of the Po. Wild mountaineers, their lips trembling with fear, told of hundreds of thousands of brown men, accompanied by strange beasts, each one as big as a house, who had suddenly emerged from the clouds of snow which surrounded the old Granian Pass, which Hercules, thousands of years before, had driven the oxen of Garon on his way from Spain to Greece. Soon, an endless stream of bedraggled refugees appeared before the gates of Rome, with more complete details. Hannibal, the son of Hamclare, with 50,000 soldiers, 9,000 horsemen, and 37 fighting elephants had crossed the Pyrenees. He had defeated the Roman army of Scipio on the banks of Rhone, and had guided his army safely across the mountain passes of the Alps, although it was October, and the roads were thickly covered with snow and ice. Then he had joined forces of the Gauls, and together they had defeated a second Roman army just before they crossed the Trebia and laid siege to Placentia, the northern terminus of a road which connected Rome with the province of the Alpine districts. The Senate, surprised but calm and energetic as usual, hushed up the news of these many defeats and sent 2 fresh armies to stop the invader. Hannibal managed to surprise these troops on a narrow road along the shores of Trasimene Lake, and there he killed all the Roman officers and most of their men. This time there was a panic among the people of Rome, but the Senate kept its nerve. A third army was organized, and the command was given to Quintus Fabius Maximus, with full power to act as was necessary to save the state. Fabius knew that he must be very careful lest all be lost. His raw and untrained men, the last available soldiers, were no match for Hannibal's veterans. He refused to accept a battle, but forever he followed Hannibal, destroyed everything eatable, destroyed the roads, attacked small detachments, and generally weakened the morale of the Carthaginian troops by a most distressing and annoying form of guerrilla warfare. Such methods, however, did not satisfy the fearsome crowds who had found safety behind the walls of Rome. They wanted action. Something must be done, and must be done quickly. A popular hero by the name of Varro, the sort of man who went about the city telling everybody how much better he could do things than slow old Fabius the Delayer, was made commander-in-chief by popular acclamation. At the Battle of Cannae, he suffered the most terrible defeat of Roman history. More than 70,000 men were killed. Hannibal was master of all Italy. He marched from one end of the peninsula to the other, proclaiming himself the deliverer of the yoke of Rome, and asking the different provinces to join him in warfare upon the mother city. Then once more the wisdom of Rome bore noble fruit. With the exceptions of Capua and Sycharos, all Roman cities remained loyal. Hannibal the deliverer found himself opposed by the people whose friend he pretended to be. He was far away from the home and did not like the situation. He sent messengers to Carthage to ask for fresh up supplies and new men. Alas, Carthage could not send him either. The Romans with their boarding bridges were the masters of the sea. Hannibal must help himself as best he could. He continued to defeat the Roman armies that were sent out against him, but his own numbers were decreasing rapidly, and the Italian peasants held aloof from the self-appointed deliverer. After many years of uninterrupted victories, Hannibal found himself besieged in the country which he had just conquered. For a moment, the luck seemed to turn. Hasdrubal, his brother, had defeated the Roman armies in Spain. He had crossed the Alps to come to Hannibal's assistance. He sent messengers to the south to tell of his arrival and asked the other army to meet him in the plains of Tiber. Unfortunately, the messengers fell into the hands of the Romans, and Hannibal waited in vain for further news until his brother's head, neatly packed in a basket, came rolling into his camp and told him of the fate of the last of the Carthaginian troops. With Hasdrubal out of the way, young Publius Scipio easily reconquered Spain, and 4 years later the Romans were ready for a final attack upon Carthage. Hannibal was called back. He crossed the African Sea and tried to organize the defenses of his home city. In the year 202 at the Battle of Zama, the Carthaginians were defeated. Hannibal fled to Tyre. From there he went to Asia Minor to stir up the Syrians and the Macedonians against Rome. He accomplished very little, but his activities among these. Asiatic powers gave the Romans an excuse to carry their warfare into the territory of the East and annex the greater part of the Aegean world. Driven from one city to another, a fugitive without a home, Hannibal at last knew that the end of his ambitious dream had come. His beloved city of Carthage had been ruined by the war. She had been forced to sign a terrible peace. Her navy had been sunk. She had been forbidden to make war without Roman permission. She had been condemned to pay the Romans millions of dollars for endless years to come. Life offered no hope of a better future. In the year 190 BC, Hannibal took poison and killed himself. 40 years later, the Romans forced their last war upon Carthage. 3 long years, the inhabitants of old Phoenician colony held out against the power of the new republic. Hunger forced them to surrender. The few men and women who had survived the siege were sold as slaves. The city was set on fire. For 2 whole weeks, the storehouses and the palaces and the great arsenal burned. Then a terrible curse was pronounced upon the blackened ruins and the Roman legions to return to Italy to enjoy their victory. For the next 1,000 years, the Mediterranean remained a European sea. But as soon as the Roman Empire had been destroyed, Asia made another attempt to dominate the great inland sea, as you will learn when I tell you about Muhammad. The rise of Rome. How Rome happened. The Roman Empire was an accident. No one planned it. It happened. No famous generals or statesmen or cutthroat ever got up and said, "Friends, Romans, citizens, we must found an empire. Follow me, and together we shall conquer all the lands from the great gates of Hercules to Mount Taurus." Rome produced famous generals and equally distinguished statesmen and cutthroats. The Roman armies fought all over the world. But the Roman Empire making was done without a preconceived plan. The average Roman was a very matter-of-fact citizen. He disliked theories about government. When someone began to recite eastward, the course of Roman Empire, etc., etc., he hastily left the forum. He just continued to take more and more land because circumstances forced him to do so. He was not driven by ambition or by greed. Both by nature and inclination, he was a farmer and wanted to stay at home. But when he was attacked, he was obliged to defend himself, and when the enemy happened to cross the sea to ask for aid in a distant country, then the patient Roman marched many dreary miles to defeat this dangerous foe. And when this had been accomplished, he stayed behind to administer his newly conquered provinces, lest they fall into the hands of wandering barbarians and become themselves a menace to Roman safety. It sounds rather complicated, and yet to the contemporaries it was so very simple, as you shall see in a moment. In the year 203 BC, Scipio had crossed the African Sea and had carried the war into Africa. Carthage had called Hannibal back. Badly supported by his mercenaries, Hannibal had been defeated near Zama. The Romans had asked for his surrender, and Hannibal had fled to get aid from the kings of Macedonia and Syria, as I told you in my last chapter. The rulers of these two countries, remnants of the empire of Alexander the Great, just then were contemplating an expedition against Egypt. They hoped to divide the rich Nile Valley between themselves. The king of Egypt had heard of this, and he had asked Rome to come to his support. The stage was set for a number of highly interesting plots and counterplots, but the Romans, with their lack of imagination, rang the curtain down before the play had been fairly stated. The legions completely defeated the heavy Greek phalanx, which was still used by the Macedonians as their battle formation. That happened in the year 197 BC at the Battle of the Plains of Sea of Dogheads in central Thessaly. The Romans then marched southward to Attica and informed the Greeks that they had come to deliver the Hellenes from the Macedonian yoke. The Greeks, having learned nothing in their years of semi-slavery, used their new freedom in a most unfortunate way. All the little city-states once more began to quarrel with each other as they had done in the good old days. The Romans had little understanding and less love for these silly bickerings of a race which they rather despised, showed great forbearance. But tiring of these endless dissensions, they lost patience, invaded Greece, burned down Corinth to encourage the other Greeks, and sent a Roman governor to Athens to rule this turbulent province. In this way, Macedonia and Greece became buffer states which protected Rome's eastern frontier. Meanwhile, right across the Hellespont lay the kingdom of Syria. And Antiochus III, who ruled the vast land, had shown great eagerness when his distinguished guest, General Hannibal, explained to him how easy it would be to invade Italy and sack the city of Rome. Lucius Scipio, a brother of Scipio the African fighter who had defeated Hannibal and his Carthaginian at Zama, was sent to Asia Minor. He destroyed the armies of the Syrian king near Magnesia in the year 190 BC. Shortly afterwards, Antiochus was lynched by his own people. Asia Minor became a Roman protectorate, and the small city republic of Rome was the mistress of most of the lands which bordered upon the Mediterranean. The Roman Empire. How the Republic of Rome, after centuries of unrest and revolution, became an empire. When the Roman armies returned from these many victorious campaigns, they were received with great jubilation. Alas and alack, their sudden glory did not make the country any happier. On the contrary, the endless campaigns had ruined the farmers who had been obliged to do the hard work of empire making. They had placed too much power in the hands of the successful generals and their private friends, who had used the war as an excuse for wholesale robbery. The old Roman Republic had been proud of the simplicity which had characterized the lives of her famous men. The new Republic felt ashamed of the shabby coats and the high principles which had been fashionable in the days of its grandfathers. It became a land of rich people ruled by rich people for the benefit of rich people. As such, it was doomed to disastrous failure, and I shall now tell you. Within less than a century and a half, Rome had become the mistress of practically all the land around the Mediterranean. In those early days of history, a prisoner of war lost his freedom and became a slave. The Romans regarded war as a very serious business, and he showed no mercy to a conquered foe. After the fall of Carthage, the Carthaginian women and children were sold into bondage, together with their own slaves. And a like fate awaited the obstinate inhabitants of Greece and Macedonia, and Spain and Syria when they declared to revolt against the Roman power. 2,000 years ago, a slave was merely a piece of machinery. Nowadays, a rich man invests his money in factories. The rich people of Rome, senators, generals, and war profiteers, invested theirs in land and in slaves. The land they bought or took in the newly acquired provinces. The slaves they bought in open market wherever they happened to be the cheapest. During most of the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, there was a plentiful supply, and as a result, the landowners worked their slaves until they dropped dead in their tracks when they bought new ones at the nearest bargain counter of Corinthian or Carthaginian captives. And now behold the fate of the freeborn farmer. He had done his duty toward Rome, and he had fought her battles without complaint. But when he came home after 10, 15, or 20 years, his lands were covered with weeds, and his family had been ruined. But he was a strong man, and willing to begin life anew. He sowed and planted, and waited for the harvest. He carried his grain to the market together with his cattle and his poultry, to find that the large landowners who worked their estates with slaves could underbid him all along the line. For a couple of years he tried to hold his own. Then he gave up in despair. He left the country and he went to the nearest city. In the city he was as hungry as he had been before on the land. But he shared his misery with the thousands of other disinherited beings. They crouched together in filthy hovels in the suburbs of the larger cities. They were apt to get sick and die from terrible epidemics. They were all profoundly discontented. They had fought for their country, and this was their reward. They were always willing to listen to those plausible spellbinders who gave around a public grievance, like so many hungry vultures, and soon they became a grave menace to the safety of the state. But the class of the newly rich shrugged its shoulders. We have our army and our policemen, they argued. They will keep the mob in order, and they hid themselves behind the high walls of their pleasant villas, and cultivated their gardens, and read the poems of a certain Homer, which a Greek slave had just translated into very pleasing Latin hexameters. In a few families, however, the old tradition of unselfish service to the Commonwealth continued. Cornelia, the daughter of Scipio Africanus, had been married to a Roman by the name of Gracchus. She had 2 sons, Tiberius and Gaius. When the boys grew up, they entered politics and tried to bring about certain much-needed reforms. A census had been shown that most of the land of the Italian peninsula was owned by 2,000 noble families. Tiberius Gracchus having been elected a tribune, tried to help freemen. He received 2 ancient laws which restricted the number of acres which a single owner might possess. In this way he hoped to retrieve the valuable old class of small and independent freeholders. The newly rich called him a robber and an enemy of the state. There were street riots. A party of thugs was hired to kill the popular tribune. Tiberius Gracchus had been attacked when he entered the assembly and was beaten to death. 10 years later, his brother Gaius tried the experiment of reforming a nation against the expressed wishes of a strong privileged class. He passed a poor law, which was meant to help the destitute farmers. Eventually, it made the greater part of the Roman citizens into professional beggars. He established colonies of destitute people in distant parts of the empire. But these settlements failed to attract the right sort of people. Before Gaius Gracchus could do more harm, he too was murdered, and his followers were either killed or exiled. The first 2 reforms had been gentlemen. The 2 who came after were of very different stamp. They were professional soldiers. One was called Marius. The name of the others was Sulla. Both enjoyed a large personal following. Sulla was the leader of the landowners. Marius, the victor in great battle at the foot of the Alps when the Teutons and the Cimbri had been annihilated, was popular hero of a disinherited freeman. Now it happened in the year 88 BC that the Senate of Rome was greatly disturbed by rumors that came before Asia. Mithridates, king of a country along the shores of the Black Sea, and a Greek on his mother's side, had seen the possibility of establishing a second Alexandrian empire. He began his campaign for world domination with the murder of all Roman citizens who happened to be in Asia Minor, men, women, and children. Such an act, of course, meant war. The Senate equipped an army to march against the king of Pontus and punish him for his crime. But who was to be commander-in-chief? Sulla, said the Senate, because he is consul. Marius, said the mob, because he has been consul 5 times, because he is the champion of our rights. Possession is 9 points of the law. Sulla happened to be in actual command of the army. He went west to defeat Mithridates, and Marius fled to Africa. There he waited until he heard that Sulla had crossed into Asia. He then returned to Italy, gathered a motley crew of malcontents, marched on Rome, and entered the city with his professional highwaymen, spent 5 days and 5 nights slaughtering the enemies of the senatorial party, got himself elected consul, and promptly died from the excitement of the last fortnight. There followed 4 years of disorder. Then Sulla, having defeated Mithridates, announced that he was ready to return to Rome and settle a few old scores of his own. He was as good as his word. For weeks, his soldiers were busy executing those of their fellow citizens who were suspected of democratic sympathies. One day they got hold of a young fellow who had been often seen in the company of Marius. They were going to hang him when someone interfered. The boy is too young, he said, and they let him go. His name was Julius Caesar. You shall meet him again on the next page. As for Sulla, he became dictator, which meant sole and supreme leader of all the Roman possessions. He ruled Rome for 4 years, and he died quietly in his bed, having spent the last year of his life tenderly raising his cabbages, as was the custom of so many Romans who'd spent a lifetime killing their fellow men. But conditions did not grow better. On the contrary, they grew worse. Another general, Gnaeus Pompeius, or Pompey, a close friend of Sulla, went eastward to renew the war against the ever-troublesome Mithridates. He drove that energetic continent into the mountains, where Mithridates took possession and killed himself, well knowing what fate awaited him as a Roman captive. Next, he re-established the authority of Rome over Syria, destroyed Jerusalem, roamed through Western Asia trying to retrieve the myth of Alexander the Great, and at last in the year 62 returned to Rome with a dozen shiploads of defeated kings and princes and generals, all of whom were forced to march in a triumphal procession of the enormously popular Roman who presented his city with the sum of $40 million in plunder. It was necessary that the government of Rome be placed in the hands of a strong man. Only a few months before, the town had almost fallen into the hands of a good-for-nothing young aristocrat by the name of Catiline, who had gambled away his money and hoped to reimburse himself for his losses by a little plundering. Cicero, a publicly spirited lawyer, had discovered the plot, had warned the Senate, and had forced Catiline to flee. But there were other young men with similar ambitions, and it was no time for idle talk. Pompey organized a triumvirate, which was to take charge of affairs. He became the leader of his vigilante committee. Gaius Julius Caesar, who had made a reputation for himself as governor of Spain, was the second in command. The third was an indifferent sort of person by the name of Kraus. He had been elected because he was incredibly rich, having been a successful contractor of war supplies. He soon went upon an expedition against the Parthians and was killed. As for Caesar, who was by far the ablest of the three, he decided that he needed a little more military glory to become a popular hero. He crossed the Alps and conquered that part of the world which is now called France. Then he hammered a solid wooden bridge across the Rhine and invaded the land of the wild Teutons. Finally, he took ship and visited England. Heaven knows where he might have ended if he had not been forced to return to Italy. Pompey, so he was informed, had been appointed dictator for life. This, of course, meant that Caesar was to be placed on the list of retired officers. The idea did not appeal to him. He remembered they had begun life as the follower of Marius. He decided to teach the senators and their dictator another lesson. He crossed the Rubicon River, which separated the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul from Italy. Everywhere he was received as the friend of the people. Without difficulty, Caesar entered Rome and Pompey fled to Greece. Caesar followed him and defeated his followers near Pharsalus. Pompey sailed across the Mediterranean and escaped to Egypt. When he landed, he was murdered by order of young King Ptolemy. A few days later, Caesar arrived. He found himself caught in a trap. Both the Egyptians and the Roman garrison, which had remained faithful to Pompey, attacked his camp. Fortune was with Caesar. He succeeded in setting fire to the Egyptian fleet. Incidentally, the sparks of the burning vessels fell on the roof of the famous Library of Alexandria, which was just off the waterfront, and destroyed it. Next, he attacked the Egyptian army, drove the soldiers into the Nile, drowned Ptolemy, and established a new government under Cleopatra, the sister of the late king. Just then, word reached him that Pharnaces and the son of Arab Mithridates had gone on the warpath. Caesar marched northward, defeated Pharnaces in a war which lasted 5 days, sent word of his victory to Rome in the famous sentence, Veni, Vidi, Vici, which is Latin for I came, I saw, I conquered, and returned to Egypt, where he fell desperately in love with Cleopatra, who followed him to Rome when he returned to take charge of the government in the year 46. He marched at the head of the not less than 4 different victory parades, having won 4 different campaigns. Then Caesar appeared in the Senate to report upon his adventures, and the grateful Senate made him dictator for 10 years. It was a fatal step. The new dictator made serious attempts to reform the Roman state. He made it possible for free men to become members of the Senate. He conferred the rights of citizenship upon distant communities he had done in the early days of Roman history. He permitted foreigners to exercise influence upon the government. He reformed the administration of the distant provinces of certain aristocratic families had come to regard as their private possessions. In short, he did many things for the good of the majority of the people, which made him thoroughly unpopular with the most powerful men in the state. 100 young aristocrats formed a plot to save the republic. On the Ides of March, the 15th of March according to the new calendar which Caesar had brought with him from Egypt, Caesar was murdered when he entered the Senate. Once more, Rome was without a master. There were 2 men who tried to continue the tradition of Caesar's glory. One was Antony, his former secretary. The other was Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and heir to his estate. Octavian remained in Rome, but Antony went to Egypt to be near Cleopatra, with whom he too had fallen in love, as seems to have been the habit of Roman generals. A war broke out between the two. In the Battle of Actium, Octavian defeated Antony. Antony killed himself, and Cleopatra was left alone to face the enemy. She tried very hard to make Octavian her 3rd Roman conquest. When she saw that she could make no impressions upon this very proud aristocrat, she killed herself, and Egypt became a Roman province. As for Octavian, he was a very wise young man, and he did not repeat the mistake of his famous uncle. He knew how people shy at words. He was very modest in his demands. When he returned to Rome, he did not want to be a dictator. He would be entirely satisfied with the title of the Honorable. But when the Senate a few years later addressed him as Augustus the Illustrious, he did not object, and a few years later the man in the street called him Caesar, or Kaiser, and while the soldiers accustomed to regard Octavian as their commander-in-chief referred to him as the chief, the imperator of the emperor. The republic had become an empire, and the average Roman was hardly aware of the fact. In 14 AD, his position as the absolute ruler of a Roman people had become so well established that it was made an object of that divine worship which hitherto has been reserved for the gods. And his successors were true emperors, the absolute rulers of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. If the truth be told, the average citizen was sick and tired of anarchy and disorder. He did not care who ruled him, provided the new master gave him a chance to live quietly and without the noise of eternal street riots. Octavian assured his subjects 40 years of peace. He had no desire to extend the frontiers of his domains. In the year 9 AD, he had contemplated an invasion of the northwestern wilderness, which was inhabited by the Teutons. But Varus, his general, had been killed with all his men in Teutoburg woods, and after that, the Romans made no further attempt to civilize these wild people. They concentrated their efforts upon the gigantic problem of internal reform. But it was too late to do much good. 2 centuries of revolution and foreign war had repeatedly killed the best men among the younger generations. It had ruined the class of the free farmers. It had introduced slave labor, against which no free man could hope to compete. It had turned the cities into beehives, inhabited by pauperizers and unhealthy mobs of runaway peasants. It had created a large bureaucracy, petty officials who were underpaid and who were forced to take graft in order to buy bread and clothing for their families. Worst of all, it had accustomed people to violence, to bloodshed, to a barbarous pleasure in the pain and suffering of others. Outwardly, the Roman state during the 1st century of our era was a magnificent political structure, so large that Alexander's empire became one of its minor provinces. Underneath this glory, there lived millions upon millions of poor and tired human beings, toiling like ants who have built a nest underneath a heavy stone. They worked for the benefit of someone else. They shared their food with the animals on the fields. They lived in stables. They died without hope. It was the 753rd year since the founding of Rome. Gaius Julius Caesar, Octavius Augustus, was living in the palace of Palestine Hill, busily engaged upon the task of ruling his empire. In a little village of distant Syria, Mary, the wife of Joseph the carpenter, was tending her little boy, born in a stable of Bethlehem. This is a strange world. Before long, the palace and the stable were to meet in open combat, and the stable was to emerge victorious.